Well, friends, our gospel lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" Well, I don't know about you. For example, in restaurants, I don't know if I can remember the last time I ever sent food back. I don't know. I just don't. I mean, they give me something that's awful. It was not what I was expecting. It just isn't what I hoped for, and yet I'll just take it. People go, be careful if you send it back. They might do something to the food. You worry about that. And then, of course, there's always those days we have when you feel like if you need to call customer service, you need to, block out your entire morning. And then you get on the phone and you call that number, and then you go through layer after layer. Probably the worst language I've ever used in my life is when there's a robot on the other end. Because you just get so frustrated at this thing, and you go through layer and layer voicemail, and suddenly, you start screaming words like operator or representative in the hope that the thing will send you over to an actual person. And then after you scream that for a while, they send you to an actual person, and after 10 minutes with the actual person, you're almost like, "Can I have the robot back, please?" It's so frustrating. And sometimes I actually think they do it on purpose. See, sometimes I think the idea is that if they can make it really, really, really hard for you to get satisfaction, you'll just give up. Just sit there and say, okay, they just figure how many people will just wrestle with the robots for only so long before they do it. And then they wrestle with the customer service person. And then you wrestle with that. And by the time they've hidden the people who can actually do something so far that most people just decide, all right, I'm just going to give up. The problem I had is not worth the amount of trouble you're making me go through to fix the problem. And that's kind of what this story is about. This is a parable Jesus tells about a really unhappy customer. Okay, it's a really unhappy customer, and he says, in that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." Now, the thing about this is that we presume in Bible stories that there's a certain default economy of words, okay? So we always presume that they don't give you a detail unless there's meaning behind the detail. So that if they say it was a widow and not a woman, all right, there's meaning. There's a reason why, especially when it's a parable, because then it's not factual, it's a story, okay? And so that he wouldn't have added this dimension of specificity on the character unless that was meaningful. And so when the widow goes to the judge, there are a few things that come to mind in that culture of why she's complaining. One of the things is that because she's a widow, she's left without resources to care for herself. Because in the culture of that time, the women could not inherit property. Okay? And so what would happen is that if she's a widow, she doesn't get the property. The property goes to the male heirs. And what's supposed to happen in that time, however, is that the obligations go with the property. And so her husband was obligated to take care of her, and when he dies, she can't inherit the property, but whoever gets the property inherits the responsibility of taking care of her as well. all right? And that works fine if it was like a son, all right? A son, a brother, something that you would tend to presume a close relation would do that. But if there was no close relation, then it might be that the person would just ignore the obligation. And so one of the things that scholars say is a likely scenario for an audience to hear in hearing this story would be the assumption, okay, her problem is that she's not being cared for. Because the widow is always a stand-in in the scriptures for someone who is disadvantaged, for someone who has no power, all right? So she's coming to the judge and saying, look, I'm not getting what I was supposed to get. I'm not getting, what I deserved. And she keeps coming. And then the story gets funny, right? The story is actually really very funny and they should have kept the humor in it. These words here, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. Those words that got translated as bothering and wear me out are interesting words in Greek. The word that's bothering is actually beating. Because she keeps beating on me. And so the image is she keeps beating on me. And the word that gets translated there as wear me out is actually this word that, it's this Greek word hupopiazo, which means under the eye. As in, she's giving me a black eye. She's beating on me, and I'm getting a black eye. All right, this is getting embarrassing. She's beating on me, and I'm getting a black eye from this. Now, remember, this is a parable. This is not a factual story. It's a made-up story that Jesus is telling to give an example. And one of the things that comes through in this is from the ancient culture, this idea of gods being shamed. Okay, so, it was an honor-shame society, and one of the things about gods back then is that gods were very parochial. Gods were for a given country, a given people, a given region. And so you see in the Old Testament, you see, Jonah is traveling, and they're like, who are your gods? You're from a different land, who are your gods? Because the presumption was that there is gods for you and gods for you. So there'd be gods over one country and different gods over another country, okay? And in fact, when Judaism brings this idea of monotheism into play, this idea of one God, the major thing is not just that there's only one God, but that it's one God everywhere. See, it would be one thing to say, okay, how many gods do you have? Well, we have 17 gods. How many gods do you have? Oh, we have 8 gods. And if someone were to say, how many gods do you have? Well, we only have one God. They go, well, we're very sorry for you. We have so many more gods than you. But the big thing was the idea of saying that it's one God over all the land, one God over all the earth. That was this huge philosophical shift, okay? But in that time, they just thought of gods being kind of parochial, and so this notion that gods could be shamed would bear out in things like war. And so countries would go to war, and it was seen as a proxy battle between their gods. So country A goes against country B. That is actually a test of the strength of the gods of country A versus the gods of country B. And if the gods of country B aren't strong enough to beat the gods of country A, not only are the people defeated and enslaved and all that, but their gods are shamed. Their gods are embarrassed. And people just thought about that. I mean, that's the story of how Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, who converts to Christianity, converted because he had a dream of the Chi Rho symbol, those letters that stood for Christ, and he painted a Chi Rho on his soldiers' shields. And then they win this battle that was kind of improbable for them to win. And Constantine's like, that is one awesome God. I'm going to worship that God. That God rocks, So I'm going to worship that God because that God is so strong, all right? And so he's kind of, in this story, kind of playing into that and saying, you know what? Your God's not going to be shamed. Don't worry. The power here is not going to be shamed. It's not going to let you down. It's not going to be embarrassed by not following through on the promises. So it's a very funny story, very funny imagery. Now, what does the story mean? This is actually one of the few stories where they tell you. All right, so they just tell you what it means. All right, there's no interpretation here. In fact, you kind of can't do it because Luke, remember, this is Luke, the narrator, telling you this at the beginning of the story. All right, it's the narrator. It's not Jesus. Jesus didn't say, I'm going to tell you the story. It's Luke writing about the story who says, then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. When they tell you that, you're kind of stuck as a preacher. Because you really can't sit here and go, I actually think this story means something else. And Luke is wrong. No, okay, he put it there. He said, this is what it's about. So you're kind of trapped into saying, this is what the parable is about. Now, they only do that when the parable is kind of confusing, and this story was a little confusing. It was confusing because neither character is necessarily terribly sympathetic, okay? Neither the widow who's beating on the judge is sympathetic, nor is the judge a sympathetic character. So this is one of the few parables where the expectation is not that you're going to identify with one of the characters in it, but rather you're going to enter the parable as an observer and just see what it means by watching. But when Luke says this is about praying and not losing heart, I think one of the things that we need to remember is what is the danger of losing heart? You know, what happens when we lose heart? When we lose heart, and sometimes we underestimate the magnitude of this, when we lose heart, we become the problem. When we lose heart, we become the problem because we concede to the forces of bad. All right? So when the business cheats you or doesn't fulfill their promises to you, doesn't deliver on the product you were supposed to get, doesn't live up to their word, overcharges you, whatever, when you lose heart, when you decide you're not going to complain, when you decide to walk away, they win. And when you let them win, you become a part of the problem. When you let them win, you become a part of the problem because what does that mean? They're just going to do it to the next person. Okay. So there is this problem of losing heart. When you lose heart, you become a person who perpetuates injustice, not through actively doing it, but through your passivity. When you decide that things are going, when you let it slide, you let it happen. And you let it happen again. And that becomes a problem for all of us because it perpetuates the problems that are present in society. Instead, we're called to stick with what's right, to stick with what's good, to believe that that is what wins in the end. And Jesus says, will not God grant justice? Will not God grant justice? You know? How often have you known someone who tried, who did something good, and tried over and over and over, and then after they succeed, you can look at it and think, what if they had quit? What if they had quit? How many times have you seen people quit? They tried it twice, they gave up. They tried it 3 times, and they gave up. And you have to wonder, what if the next one would have been the one? What if it only took one more try? What if it only took 2 more tries? You know, I look at some people in their careers. One of the things I love among celebrities is I love the stories of like actors or actresses who were just, spending decades waiting tables. And then suddenly they get a little bit later in life and they get that one breakout role and suddenly they're huge stars, okay? And I just love the fact that they just stuck with it and stuck with it and stuck with it. And I just love, I remember this interview, I loved this story. You remember Edie Falco, okay? She was in Nurse Jackie, but her breakout role was being Mrs. Soprano in The Sopranos. And she had, been a New York actress, an occasional Law and Order episode like every actor in New York. I saw a casting director one time say that if you were an actor in New York and you hadn't done a Law and Order, they wondered what was wrong with you. And but she kept trying, and then finally she lands this role. And they're doing an interview. What's it like? You've now hit it big. You just signed a huge contract when they, extended The Sopranos. And she said, yeah. She said, but she still never forgot the struggle. And so she'd signed, for multi-million dollars a season. She was signed, and they interviewed her, and she said, I still walk down, a street in Manhattan, and I look at a restaurant, and I'll just look inside, and I'll go, they do a good lunch business. Because she had waited tables for so many years while she was pursuing her career. It never escaped the back of her mind of seeing a restaurant and going, yeah, good lunch business. Tips are probably pretty good there. So I love people who persist. I love people who have this idea of what they're supposed to do, and they just stick with it. Right? And if it's important for doing something like starting a business or advancing your career, how much more important is it when it comes to just doing what's right? When it comes to just doing what's good and saying, you know what, I'm going to persist in it, and I'm not going to give up on it. I'm not going to concede. I'm not going to sit there and say, I don't think doing right works. Because as soon as you give up, then the bad wins, the wrong wins. Right? It just wears you down, and you can't let it win. But if you have confidence that it wins, then you stick with it. And you have to remember that if you give up, if you allow the injustice to stand, you're on the wrong side of God's story. If you allow the injustice to stand, you are on the wrong side of God's story. Because God's eventual story, looking back, is the story of how it looked bad for a long time, but God won. It's the actress waiting tables for 18 years, waiting for a break, but then year 19, and they got the big role. All right. God's story is one where it looks hopeless all the way to the end, and then at the end, God wins. The story of Christ looks really stupid on Friday night, but then comes Sunday, and he wins. And if you believe in the ending, if you believe that the end is that good wins, then why wouldn't you position yourself on that side of the story? If you know that that's what's going to win, why would you want to be on the other side? Because you know that at some point, you'll have been on the wrong side of history. Think of how many people, in the face of how many evil things that have been perpetuated in our world, at some point, they may not have been on board with it at the start, but at some point it looked inevitable, and so they said, all right, that's the way it's going, so I'll go along. And they became a part of the problem. And for the rest of history, they're remembered as having been on the wrong side of the story. I want you to read these words with me. Let's just read these together. Because this is not a new problem. This idea of giving up on God's ultimate deliverance is not a new problem. It's a forever problem. And you go back into the Old Testament, you go back into the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's all over the place. Because the Jewish people went through so many things, right? They go through slavery in Egypt. They go through being conquered in the Babylonian exile. Through all these things that happened to the Jewish people, they continually asked the question, really? Do we lose? Does this end here? Are we going to lose? And throughout it all is God's reminder, no. It looks bad. All right? It looks like you're down 6 runs in the bottom of the 9th. but you haven't seen the comeback yet. So I want you to read these words together. I want you to remember these words. They're from the 13th Psalm. It's David writing. Can we read these together? Because I think we need to remember them. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. That's the trajectory that repeats itself all through Scripture. It looked bad. It looked hard. The people cried out to God. But in the end, the good won. You know? Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? When Jesus comes, will you be one of those who just stuck it out, or one of those who gave up? One of those who said, you know, it looked so bleak, I lost heart. I lost faith. I gave up. The water trick, which finally worked. In a way, it was a metaphor. Third try, it worked. Seems impossible, but eventually it worked. You had to trust that it would. And when you trust that good wins, when you trust that God wins, it doesn't matter when. Doesn't matter when. Keep trusting. Amen.